that's somewhat accurate to what you explained. And you mentioned that, you know, countries like ours, have, democracies such as ours, have historically produced unjust results, including the South African apartheid system, racial segregation, Jim Crow, and the Vietnam War that were protested using tactics of civil disobedience, where groups feel they cannot get a fair hearing through normal channels. And so they're going to try an alternative route to engage the public. So Dr. Armour, could you tell us more about what is civil disobedience? And do you see the current pro-Palestinian protests happening around the country as acts of civil disobedience?
Yeah, thanks. And you nicely summarized what my viewpoint is. My viewpoint is based on the writings of people like Martin Luther King Jr., John Rawls, Ronald Dworkin, other theorists who have pointed out that the disobedience part of civil disobedience is breaking rules. By definition, you are breaking rules. So a lot of times, for example, administrators at my university and a lot of others will justify sending in police, riot police and riot gear, often some resorting to things like mace, pepper spray, batons, handcuffs, tasers. At Columbia, there was even a live round of ammunition discharged from a firearm when they were going into Hamilton Hall. The administrators who justify these kinds of police interventions will often justify them on the grounds that the students weren't following the rules. You were breaking the rules. And so this is the consequence that follows from any time you break the rules, right? Well, then there can be no civil disobedience without bringing in riot police if that's your position, because by definition, civil disobedience is going to be breaking the rules, disobeying some rules, right? And what people are saying when they're breaking those rules in acts of civil disobedience, going back to MLK, Martin Luther King, for example, is that the normal channels of democratic decision-making are not working. They are resulting in gross injustices that make us cry out. For example, Jim Crow and the civil rights movement involved a lot of civil disobedience, and it was the democratic processes that gave us Jim Crow, that gave us segregation, that gave us the American version of apartheid. Those were all democratic institutions that were established through democratic channels. And the people who were protesting were saying these results of the democratic process, like laws that forbid interracial marriage and laws that don't allow people who have any Black blood in them to be in town after sunset, or any number of other laws that were products of the democratic process, are just unjust. And we're going to get into the conversation about their injustice by this act of civil disobedience. So these acts of civil disobedience are part of a dialogue in the democratic process itself. They are part of a way of bringing attention to an injustice that's not being addressed properly through democratic channels. And the hope is, by the people who are engaging in civil disobedience, that by bringing attention to this matter and the way they are, they will start to stir the conscience of the nation, stir the conscience of people who aren't otherwise paying close attention to these injustices. So we start out with the civil rights movement, you saw that. The Vietnam War was the same kind of thing. The democratic processes got us the Vietnam War and policies that supported the Vietnam War. And you had civil disobedience, part of student activists especially, and others resisting that. Then when I was these students' age, we had the same kind of thing happening with apartheid in South Africa, right? There was our universities were invested in South Africa, were promoting that system through their investments. And those kinds of processes we wanted to disrupt, draw attention through civil disobedience. We didn't call them camps at the time. We weren't pitching tents and calling them camps. We were calling them shanty towns. right? And we were setting up shanty towns and drawing attention to those kinds of injustices, right? And so this is part of that long tradition. And it's a part of the democratic process to have these conversations. This is part of the conversation to have this kind of civil disobedience. And the conversation stops, though, the conversation stopper is bringing in riot police, because there's no conversation at that point. There's just people with tools of violence like guns and tasers and batons and pepper spray who are shutting down the conversation entirely and arresting people. So that is, just kind of as a backdrop, the recognition that I want us to start out thinking about, not being so black and white about rule adherence, recognizing that violating the rules sometimes can be a way of encouraging dialogue in the democratic process itself, and has been an effective way historically. It was effective in the civil rights movement. They've been historically vindicated. In the Vietnam War movement, they've been historically vindicated. The South African divestment movement, they were historically vindicated. I would hope that if we were in 1858 and slavery was still the law of the land, the democratic process has given us slavery, I would hope the students would start pitching tents and saying, we oppose slavery. I would hope that if it was 1938, 39, or 40, and we were hearing about our Jewish brothers and sisters being rounded up and put into boxcars and sent to concentration camps, and they were using some of the locomotive equipment and some of the railroad tracks being made by U.S. manufacturers, I would hope that we would start pitching some tents against concentration camps for our Jewish brothers and sisters. So that is kind of the general background that I would hope that we bring to when we're thinking about civil disobedience.
Thank you for that historical context. Bryce, what is IU Divestment Coalition? Oh, sorry, before I ask that, are you a member of IU Divestment Coalition?
Yes, I am a spokesperson for the group.
Okay, perfect. What is IU Divestment Coalition hoping to achieve from the rallies, protests, and the encampment? And is this an act of civil disobedience in your view?
Well, it's certainly an act of civil disobedience and solidarity with all the other encampments that are going around in the country. The goal, like most of the other encampments, is to get Indiana University to divest from all the companies and all the partnerships, co-sponsorships, what have you, that involve both the state of Israel, companies that supply the state of Israel, and organizations that support the agenda of the state of Israel. And so that's the primary demand. The secondary demand, of course, is more targeted towards the Crane specifically, which is the Naval Surface Warfare facility that's located about 30 miles south of here. The goal there is to, again, divest and disaffiliate from those partnerships. And the final goal, and you can put these in whatever order, is that we want the resignations of the president, the vice provost, and the provost for their role in making the university as corporatized and as supportive of the policies that we oppose over the last couple of years. And so those are our demands, and we hope to by doing the demonstration in the way that we are, we're both trying to capitalize on the national momentum and galvanize the local population in order to put pressure on the university to create space for these changes to be possible.
Do you view this as an act of civil disobedience?
Yes, certainly. I mean, it's in the same vein, like Dr. Amos said, in the same vein of anti-Vietnam War protests, anti-segregation protests, anti-apartheid protests, Iraq invasion protests. It's all of our duties to go out and protest when the institutions that we represent and participate in are contributing to evil. If they want to send out a militarized response in response to kids putting up tents in a park, I mean, well, what does that say about their commitment to any sort of democratic ideals? If they're going to meet civil disobedience with I mean, very literal military levels of force. I mean, you had assault weapons, grenade launchers, shotguns. There was a chopper circling overhead. They had a drone for surveillance, and then they had a sniper on the roof overwatching it all. I mean, does that make sense for? It wasn't even disruptive. I mean, unless you were planning to go camp or go put up a towel and lay down and sunbathe in that meadow, it wasn't disruptive at all. The point was, it seemed to be a political message, which I guess we can get into.
Thank you. And that's my next question on the political nature of policing and the justice system. So the CAPS Commission recently, in our special session, passed a resolution denouncing this violent suppression of pro-Palestinian protests that included the following paragraph. Whereas in the recent CAPS posted Reimagining Safety film and panel discussion held on the IU campus, we learned that many of the problems of US policing stem from the history of state repression targeted against particular racial and ethnic groups to further the practices of settler colonialism, genocide, and chattel slavery. And last week's use of violent militarized police force against city residents speaking against injustice shows that this history is far from over, unquote. Bryce, I'm going to start with you this time. Why do you think that the university administration views IU Divestment Coalition's actions as such a threat to it that warrants repeated violent militarized state police response? And do you think that you or I guess I'll let you answer that one and then next one.
Yeah, well, there are a number of reasons why I think IU met our demonstration with the level of force that it did. One of them being that many of the administrators who were in that decision-making chain are simply ignorant about what is going on in the world and what's actually going on in the campus. As I understand it, they're at the presidential level at IU, there was no clear understanding, firsthand understanding of what was actually going on the ground there. And if you follow a media environment that's dishonest and distorting what these movements are, you're liable to believe some very wacky things about these protests. And so your reaction might be completely divorced from reality. And I think that that's a significant contributing factor to why they thought they needed choppers in the sky for kids in tents. A lot of the media coverage around this has falsely portrayed the demonstrations as violent, anti-Semitic, or in some way a threat to other students on campus. Of course, that was so far removed from the reality of our encampment that you can only laugh at that. But if you look at the statements that Pamela was saying in the wake of the outcry against her response, that seems to be one of the contributing factors. This just sheer ignorance and fear. But on a structural level, it's deeper than that, because the university has very close ties to the military-industrial complex, to the decision-making class in like the foreign policy sense in America, and also the Israel lobby in particular. If you're in America and you're political, you've probably understood the vast power of the Israel lobby, like the tobacco lobby or the oil lobby or the military lobby. They have amassed a significant amount of structural power within the United States to affect both the political system, but also the social system. Many states have passed laws that make boycotting Israel straight up illegal for companies that do business with the state, and illegal. They require loyalty oaths for state employees to say that they will never boycott Israel. That's a level of power. I mean, you never had people take a loyalty oath to the Shell Corporation. We've seen just a dramatic control exerted over our political system. Congress people, they have to beg AIPAC for money every year, and AIPAC is one of those centers of the Israel lobby. But it also extends to college campuses, because college campuses are very important in ensuring that American support for Israel continues unabated. if you're able to convince the future generation of leaders that, Israel's fun, good, and safe, and that criticism of Israel is inherently evil and anti-Semitic, well, then those people will go into city councils, Congress, or the presidency, and they will be making decisions about what the institution's relationship to Israel will be. Well, that has been going on for years and years and years. The IU signed a partnership with Israel on Campus Coalition about a month or two after the Iron Swords, Al-Aqsa Flood started. And so they have every reason to ensure that they maintain calm and they maintain that support from the Israel lobby to ensure that their lives are easier. The path of least resistance is to go along with the people who have the resources to affect your institution. And so they're at a structural level, if this university didn't act swiftly and harshly against these protests, there would have been significant flack from that Israel lobby that I just mentioned. And that flack could have taken, many forms, donors starting to withhold their funds, statements denouncing the university that could hurt the public image, and all sorts of other things that would happen or could happen behind the scenes that we wouldn't even know about. So the university, it seems, took the path of least resistance, overreacted against nonviolent demonstrators, injuring some, but for all the bad press they got, perhaps they made the calculation that press was not as bad as the negative reaction of the Israel lobby.
Do you think that you or the other organizer of this protest, and maybe there are several, but I know another one was also targeted for arrest. Do you think that you were racially targeted for arrest, or that your treatment by the police or the administrative punishments that you received are connected to the political nature of what you're protesting? So either racially or politically motivated?
Right. It's difficult for me to make the case that it was racially motivated when the political motivation was just so extreme. You can find publicly available recordings of the police scanners where they found or they were looking at it and they said the black male afro with black shorts, blue shirt, that was me, appears to be an instigator. So like they had already singled me out. And the circumstances of my arrest seem to support the fact that they were targeting me because I was behind, whatever, police line or the line of protesters, and a police officer appeared to single me out and, pointed at me and said, "Don't run." So that further indicates targeting, and I wasn't doing anything that would have made me stand out compared to the other protesters. So, of course, then you have the higher sanction on me issued by the university. I was given 5 years ban from IU Bloomington campus, whereas others were only banned for 1 year. All of these seem to support the fact that they were politically targeting me specifically, in addition to politically targeting the demonstration as a whole. And so I don't see any too much evidence for racial profiling, even though they did identify as a black male. The fact is that structures of power, they can accommodate diversity a lot more than they could, 50, 60 years ago. You could have a president of the United States with a, black face and a black name still contribute to the white supremacist empire. And so for those reasons, I don't think that the race was as big a factor.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. Armour, in your book, N-Star GGA Theory, you write that, quote, the traditional model of mens rea, I don't know if I just said that right, bifurcates blameworthiness, it creating a two-pronged conception and analysis of moral culpability in the adjudication process. The first definitional or narrow mens rea of aware mental states, such as purposely, knowingly, or recklessly committing a prohibited act. And the second broad mens rea comprised of defenses or excuses and justifications such as duress or provocation and calls on fact finders to make discretionary moral judgments based on non-descriptive standards, unquote. In what ways did the decision by Indiana University administration to ask the Indiana governor to send in militarized state SWAT team to remove and arrest protesters involve this fuzzy concept of mens rea and or the non-descriptive subjective standards in your view? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, you know, what I was getting at there is in the legal process, the more we otherize defendants, the more we otherize people who are accused, the easier it is for us to condemn them and to punish them often in draconian ways, right? And this is a part of the legal doctrine itself. It's not something I'm making up. The Model Penal Code points out that the reasonable person standard at the heart of many criminal law doctrines is a legal vehicle that jurors use to express sympathy with a defendant or to withhold sympathy. And to the extent that you sympathize with an accused person, you forgive them, you exculpate them, you are more lenient toward them. To the extent that you don't sympathize or empathize with them, to the extent that you don't have care and concern for them, you more readily blame them and you ratchet up the amount of punishment that you deliver to them. And so you really have to wonder about how much the people in decision-making power here otherize the protesters, rather than seeing them as one of us, one of our students, one of our community. You know, I asked, for example, my own provost at SC, since we both had kids who went to USC, right? I had two of my sons, he had two of his sons who attended USC as undergraduates. And I asked him point blank, you know, if one of your kids was sitting in that encampment, one of those children that you raised from the time they were a baby, waddling around, you know, getting on your lap, one of your kids was sitting in that encampment, would you have unleashed those violence workers on your own children sitting in that encampment? Would you have unleashed and sicked, you know, men and women with Glocks with live ammunition and stun guns and batons and mace on your own children? And we know the answer, no, because I would be thinking that's my kid in there who will be, I'll be putting in harm's way if I, you know, mobilize these violence workers in that way. But when you don't view them as your kids, which we always saying we do, by the way, in these universities, we talk about the Trojan family, right? Or when I taught at my first teaching post was at Indiana University, right there in Bloomington, right? And they would often talk about, you know, we're a community and we're a family. Well, you don't treat family members in that way. You don't unleash, unless you're into domestic violence. You know, there are sadly some dysfunctional families who do treat family members in very violent ways. But most of us who have care and concern for our loved ones don't unleash violence workers on them unless there are extreme circumstances. There are extreme circumstances where you do have to bring in the police. If the protesters, for example, are being very violent and attacking people, et cetera, we would all understand, you know, the intervention of police there. For example, at UCLA, when the counter protesters came in, the pro-Israel protesters at UCLA and started attacking the encampment people. Remember that? You saw that on the news, that was all over. That was a prime kind of example where the police should have come in. But in all these other cases we're talking about, and there have been reports out now that have empirically demonstrated this, so it's not just Armour's opinion or somebody else's opinion, 99% of these encampments have been peaceful. There's been no violence. So there's been no cause. And when I say 99%, that sounds hyperbolic. It's not, according to these studies. It's not. Have been peaceful and so haven't warranted this kind of intervention by the police. So that's where all of that is coming in to play, without talking about mens rea. To the extent that you sympathetically identify with people, you're less likely to be draconian toward them or to unleash violence workers on them.
Thank you. Yeah, that gives me a much better understanding of that concept and how it particularly applies to these events. The next question is actually on the framework that you are developing, and I know you said it's related to the ladder of harm, which I think you attributed to some other scholars, but unfortunately I didn't make good enough notes to who they were. So when CAPS met with you, you said civil disobedience is a means for groups who are dissatisfied with the results of a democratic system. And so some civil disobedience should be tolerated. And then you said the question becomes, when should civil disobedience warrant police action based on the level of disruption or harm it's causing society? And so could you tell us more about this framework that you're developing and how it might be an appropriate response to these encampments and protests that are taking place on university campuses like IU around the US?
Sure. And I owe for these remarks or this framework, a lot of the foundational work was done by a guy named Christopher Edley. He was the dean of Berkeley Law School for a while. And in 2011, I think it was, the police were brought into UC Davis, and there were some students protesting, and they sprayed them with mace and pepper spray. And the chancellor of the university system asked him to prepare a report. And so I base a lot of these remarks on that report. And one of the things he points out, I think very nicely, is that there's really a kind of ladder of harm for civil disobedience. You know, how much disruption, you have to first ask, how much disruption is a specific protest or encampment causing, right? And there are 4 different levels of disruption that an encampment can cause. And each of those different levels of disruption may warrant a different level of reaction or intervention by a university. So at the lowest level of if you will, disruption, let's call it number 1. The number 1 would be civil disobedience that breaks the rules. Yes, you aren't supposed to camp here. You know, you're breaking the rules. You're trespassing. That's the language they often like to use. You're trespassing, but it's otherwise not disruptive. You know, the encampments are orderly. They may require some extra physical plant or grounds or security to monitor, but it's not disruptive in any way, right? That's level 1. Level 2 would be civil disobedience that is actually a little inconvenient or even significantly inconvenient, but tolerable. Inconvenient, but tolerable. You know, so let's say the encampments are orderly and they're peaceful, but they require a minor relocation of classes, exams, or office work, for example, maybe some extra security and some extra groundskeeping. Okay, that would be level 2. Level 3 would be civil disobedience that is disruptive. That is much more so, you know, that disrupts important university business, you know, and so some might consider this not tolerable. That is, the protest is so loud that it interrupts studying and teaching in a significant way. More than just a little, you know, like the band, you know, up here at USC and a lot of bands, when I was at Harvard as an undergrad there, the band would just break out into blowing bugles and pounding the drum. You know, that would last half an hour and people go on about their business, or even an hour, right? So you can have those kind of, you know, sometimes people get on the microphone and say, you know, Palestine will be free, you know, for some period of time. And then, you know, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about so loud and persistent that it seriously interrupts teaching and study. The protesters may block many students, faculty, or staff from going to class or offices, you know, say graduation cannot occur. That might be level 3, right? We're talking about it's disruptive and important university activities, and some are saying now it's not so tolerable, okay? And then finally, number 4, the 4th level would be civil disobedience that creates an imminent threat to safety, especially to life, right? So let's say the melee that we saw between the counter protesters and the protesters at UCLA, right? That one, the counter protesters were the ones who were creating it. So they were the ones that there should have been the intervention on, but that would be an example of violence, right? Let's say cases in which staff, students, or faculty are trapped in a building that's been taken over by protesters, that might be a level 4 kind of situation. And so the question becomes, when do you have an intervention on one of those 4 levels of disruption? When is it disruptive enough to justify bringing in the police? Now, there are 2 questions here, right? First is, what is the level of disruption? A lot of times you can't even get an agreement on what the level of disruption was, right? At USC, for example, I was there in the morning when they first opened up the protest site. At 8 a.m., they had yoga and meditation over here in one part of Alumni Park. At 9 a.m., they had a poetry reading over here in another little part. At 10 a.m., they had, an informational session, right? Faculty and students were together there. It was at most, that was level 1. That was a level 1 kind of situation. But when you read the report by the provost and some of the statements by the president, they were characterizing it as if it were a level 3 or 4 kind of disruption, right? And so you can't even a lot of times get an agreement on what the facts are on the ground, because you have motivated people who aren't there at the site itself, who have a reason to characterize it as much worse than it sometimes might be. And they may come from the other side and make it much less too, but most of the reports I've heard have made it characterize them as being worse, right? Especially by people who aren't there. So let's say you do get an agreement on what the facts on the ground actually were, right? And they're 1, 2, 3, or 4. You have some people who feel like if you have a number 1 disruption, a low-level civil disobedience that is not disruptive, but breaks the rules, that you should bring in the police. That's enough of a reason to bring in the police. Number 1. That's how our university at USC was talking about it. When I read the provost's letter, their idea is you got to adhere to the rules. If you don't adhere to the rules, then don't complain when we bring in the police, right? And so that's a kind of number 1 situation. Any violation of the rules is going to be enough for us to bring in the police. When they talked to the chief of police at Harvard about when he would intervene on students' encampments there, he said, I wouldn't come in for anything other than a civil disobedience that creates an imminent threat to safety, especially life. He didn't think that you crossed that threshold until you're up at number 4, right? It may be 3, but typically 4, right? So you have a big difference among people about when you've crossed the threshold of disruption that justifies bringing in the police in the first place. And I'll just close with this. If you're talking about students on your campus and you're an administrator, and these are 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old students, a lot of them a little older, but these are your students, your family, and all of that, then your threshold should not be 1 or 2, right? You should be up there at least the 3 level of disruption of university business that's serious, involving loud interruptions and blocking students, et cetera, or 4, somewhere up in that range would be the appropriate threshold. But you have a difference of opinion even about that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that sounds like it would be a very valuable framework for a university to explore before events like this occurred. Bryce, at which level on this letter of harm that you just learned do you feel IU investment coalitions, events, actions should be assessed? And do you feel that this framework might be useful for IU to use to depoliticize or reduce the subjectiveness of the decision-making on how the university should respond to acts of civil disobedience by students in the future?
So I would largely probably categorize this as a 1, maybe a 2, given that we were taking up space that may have been used by other events sometime in the future. But certainly not a 3 or 4, no imminent threat of violence. There may have been times where it had risen to 3, just because of the counter protesters who were, actively violent and provocative for the, for the purposes of getting a rise. No, so it's definitely not a violent protest in any way. And excuse me, I do think that the framework is useful for giving administrators and decision makers the tools to even like start assessing this. Because like the doctor said, there might be a tendency to flatten this all into just one response. Go in, send the military for level one for any rule breaking, just for this purpose of maintaining order. I mean, this is a good model for handling civil disobedience, but it's also a good model for handling police and use of force by law enforcement in general.
Mhm. Okay, thanks. And then the next question is on the question of how community responder teams might fit into such a framework. So one of CAP's main recommendations.
Just before going to that, can I intervene with one more wrinkle, and that is not only what level of disruption should there have to be before you cross the threshold to bring in the police, but once you've brought in the police, can we also consider, and in a kind of nuanced way, how much force the police should use? How much force should they use? Because okay, so let's say we've crossed whatever the threshold is. For me, I'd lean more toward a 4, like the police chief at Harvard, a 4, maybe 3, high end of the 3, 4, kind of area. But let's say you decided it's going to be whatever it is. You might be coming from a 2 or 3 or even a 1. I don't know. I have a hard time taking you seriously as someone who's concerned about the well-being of your students and raising them to stand for justice and teaching them to be free thinkers and critical thinkers, and you're going to drop the hammer on them when they're at level 1 or 2. But let's just say, for whatever reason, you figure they've crossed whatever threshold you think justifies bringing in the police. Then the question is, how much force should the police use? Okay, and this, again, there's 3 levels that when I look at the literature that you can look at. The first is if the protester's disposition is one of passive resistance. That's a passive resistance. That is, the actions do not prevent the officer's attempt to control a subject, right? So, for example, the subject who remains in a sitting or standing or prone or limp position with no physical contact. They're locked arms with others, right? In that case, and I'm taking this from the San Diego Police Department guidelines. Here's what the San Diego Police Department says. If you're dealing with passive resistance, the limits of force are: a subject involved in passive resistance shall not be subjected to the use of control devices, including tasers, batons, or chemical agents, including pepper spray, right? So number 1, okay, so passive resistance, how much force, that level, not beyond that. Number 2, what if you have protesters who are actively resisting, right? That is, there's evasive physical movements to defeat an officer's attempt at control, including things like bracing, tensing, linking arms, or verbally signaling an intention to avoid or prevent being taken, those kind of things. Well, according to, again, the San Diego Police Department guidelines, in that case, the use of intermediate force, right, that is pepper spray, tasers, baton strikes, shall not be used against non-aggressive displays of active resistance during a peaceful protest, such as locking arms while sitting or standing. Again, you avoid it, according to the San Diego Police Department. It's a good general guideline. And then 3, finally, active aggression, the 3rd level, active aggression by protesters. That is a threat or overt act of assault through physical means, say, coupled with the present ability to carry out the assault, like I'm getting ready to take your head off or something like that, which reasonably indicates that an assault or injury is imminent. Then the policy implies that the police may use the range of approved force options as long as it's reasonable for the circumstances. Then maybe you can go to batons and pepper spray, et cetera, when you're dealing with what could be characterized as active aggression. So those three different levels, I think, of kind of police force, how much force police should be considered along with the different levels of disruption that would justify bringing them in the first place.
And so just to clarify on what you said, those standards that you said the San Diego PD uses, would that mean that you wouldn't bring in the SWAT police who have those weapons and tools if active aggression was not displayed, or that you just wouldn't tell them to use it?
It would be best not to bring them in, wouldn't it? Because once you bring them in, right, then you open the door to misinterpretations and why are they there in the first place? Why do you have riot police when some people are just sitting in a circle singing "We Shall Overcome"? Why are they coming in with, tactical gear and all the rest for that in the first place? Right? So no, I don't see any need for that level of force for intervention unless you have active aggression.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And that is related to the next question. So one of CAP's main recommendations to the city of Bloomington in our alternative public safety report that we created last year is for the city to create a team of unarmed, highly trained community responders that should be operated outside of the police department to respond to low-level calls for help and safety crises in ways that prioritize human safety above other city goals, especially calls that involve safety marginalized people such as unhoused residents, people with mental illness, and drug users. We hope that the city of Bloomington would also collaborate in this with Indiana University Police Department to either allow the same team to be used on campus or to allow a similar team. Maybe they could develop one alongside the city with similar operating principles and the overriding goal of human safety over other goals that could be developed on campus. So yeah, first let me kick it to you, Dr. Armour. Does your framework include the determination, and you just actually answered this one, which kind of police to send in? And as you mentioned, it does. How would you include such an unarmed, highly trained team into your framework, for example? And yeah, could you talk more about what the different ranges might be and what you think the best choice for Indiana University's these alleged level of disruptions might have been? What do you think might be a better choice given the actual choices they had and given the hypothetical choice they may have had if they had developed an unarmed community responder team?
Yeah, the unarmed community responder approach has been talked about extensively now, especially since the George Floyd protest marches erupted. There was a lot of discussion about how valuable they could be, but even before then, going back to 2013 and the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement, 2014, 15, 16, and we've had some unarmed intervention models, even here in Southern California at USC. We have a number of people who are with the campus police department who are unarmed. But this community model goes further and says they don't even need to be part of the police department. They can be part of the community and be unarmed interveners there. And there is empirical data out there that points to the efficacy of these alternative approaches, right? They're in Oregon and places all around the country that we're finding that it can work. When you took armed police officers out of traffic stops, they didn't find the fatalities went up. They didn't find the crime went up. So there are lots of places where we don't need violence workers, which is what armed officers are. That's what sociologists call violence work. And the reason I use that language advisedly is because those are only tools they have that we give them, right? We give them, loaded sidearms, tasers, batons, mace, handcuffs. We give them the tools of violence. Their solution to problems are primarily violent in nature, right? And so if you send a violence worker into a situation, don't be surprised if violence is going to be the result of the interaction and at the heart of the solution that they reach for the particular problem at hand. And yeah, when it comes to mental health interventions here in LA, we found that some recent studies show that 1/3 of the people police have killed who've been citizens, civilians, have been going through a mental health crisis. And they're finding in a lot of places by having unarmed people come in and intervene, they've been able to avoid those fatal encounters. So yeah, there's a lot of data out there, and it would have been great if we had some of those possibilities. I don't know, it would have to be worked out if the community unarmed folks would have been able to go in and arrest people who are at the encampment. For one thing, it would create a possible reservoir of resentment between the people from the community and people in the encampment. A lot of times we say we want to build bridges between the campus and the surrounding community, don't we? And we say we want to encourage interactions. And then, though, when encampments are disrupted by police, they start to talk about outside agitators, meaning community people who happen to be standing with students suddenly become outside agitators. At other times, we're saying we want to build bridges with these same people. We can't quite get it straight, get it consistent. But I don't know if you're going to be able to get around at the end of the day having police come in, but they don't have to be clad in riot gear. That's for sure. They don't have to be SWAT teams. And they may even be police officers who aren't armed. You don't even, they can be part of the police department, but you can have, like we do here on campus, we have unarmed and armed police. You can have unarmed people come in who are part of the police department, not necessarily part of the community, and affect these arrests because, the arrests are going to happen. You've crossed whatever that threshold is, one, two, three. I'm hoping it's 3 or 4, but wherever it is, it's been crossed. And so, but you have only a level 1 intervention. You're only going to make arrests without any batons or anything. Yeah, that, police without sidearms, et cetera, and other tools of violence might be the most appropriate interveners there.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So that is really interesting to know when before when you're talking about your framework and when is police intervention appropriate, you were also referring to police making arrests, right? Not just police showing up and talking to people and saying, hey, why are you camping here? Did you know, so yeah. And we have explored that community responders would not be making arrests, I think, as well. So that's a good point. Thanks for that. And it is 6 o'clock, so I do want to give the opportunity to our 2 members who have tight schedules. If you want to leave, I want to just give you that opportunity to 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
Okay.
I appreciate you coming and for us. Thank you.
No, absolutely. So was your last thing. Green. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Bye. Oh, Bryce, to turn the same question, do you feel that such a community responder team would have been a better choice for responding to the divestment coalition's violation of rules around camping, assembling, or littering, rather than the state police SWAT team? And so what might have been the likely outcomes of a team responding to the rallies held on April 25th and 27th?
So this is a difficult question because I guess it presumes that there should have been a response from law enforcement or higher level authorities. When, as we discussed, the threat level was at level 1, and there was no reason for there was no emergency. There was not even a non-lethal emergency. There was no emergency whatsoever. But again, the counter protesters were a persistent presence and could provoke violence, and so there was a safety threat with them. And so the presence of community resource officers, or whatever you want to call them, simply being placed Simply being there on site
Mhm.
with the official sanction of, you know, like the state. Could have easily de-escalated the situation. The fact that they weren't violent, or that they wouldn't be armed, or they wouldn't be, able to make arrests. Would diffuse any fears that, armed goons showing up usually brings. And so I think that, they would have been perfectly fine.
Mhm.
If they had wanted to disperse the encampment, with a bunch of, community resource officers, I guess that's a sort of contradiction in terms.
Mhm.
It's like giving them a gun, which would defeat the purpose.
Mhm. Thank you. And, yeah, our last question is on consent-based decision-making. Due to the nature of our commission's work on reducing community violence and limiting the harm experienced by marginalized residents by our existing public safety institutions, the CAPS Commission strives to utilize consent-based decision-making in all of its business so that we can provide a model for other bodies in the city to resolve differences of opinion without resorting to force or authority. In national media reports, it's been reported that some other universities, not Indiana University, but other universities responded to student protests by peacefully engaging in dialogue with the protesters and reaching agreements on policy changes. Bryce, from the lens of consent-based decision-making, where all the key stakeholders, this is how I understand it, where all the key stakeholders have their views included in the decision-making process in a meaningful way, I cannot help but wonder if the university administration has attempted to include the views of tuition-paying students like yourself, and other members of the IU community on its important decision-making processes, either before or after making a decision to respond with the police.
No attempt at dialogue was made, no attempt at, any consideration that the protesters were a legitimate stakeholder. There was no such consideration. Even before the encampment went up, the administration made it clear that they were opposed to the protesters and their goals by changing the rules of the space, hours before students showed up. And they used this rule change to justify the use of force, to arrest and expel, the encampment. So there was no inkling that they would want to talk to us, and since then, there hasn't been any communication, official or otherwise, that they are interested in sitting down with us to talk about any of the issues that we've raised. And this is falling in line with the broader trend of the university's administration being inaccessible, distant, and dismissive of the concerns of the staff, faculty, and student body.
Thank you. Dr. Armour, based on your framework, how and when should universities attempt to constructively engage in dialogue, or what might be called negotiations with communities engaging in acts of civil disobedience? And so should such dialogue occur before or after a police response is sent to remove them from whatever they're disrupting?
Oh, it has to come before, as it really has to come before if it's going to really be useful, helpful. A lot of times the reason that the disruption had to happen in the first place, the reason the encampment had to happen in the first place is because the normal channels of decision making were producing unjust results, right? So the voices that are being represented in the encampment were not being taken seriously or given due weight in the deliberations that were being carried on by the administrators up to that point, right? And so here comes the encampment. At that point, the administrators have a chance to say, let's figure out a way to take these issues, these concerns more seriously. How can we do that? Can we restructure our decision-making process so that these voices that we have not been hearing can be heard more effectively, and there's a lot of structural changes they can make. Sometimes, they're just pacifying, appeasement kinds of maneuvers. We're just going to create a committee and then it's going to disappear. So it has to be meaningful interventions, not just papering over the problem with some meaningless committees. But if they can make real efforts to include those voices in the decision-making process, a lot of times that's what the students want, and haven't been getting, which is what has driven them to these extreme measures in the first place. It used to be the same with, I'll analogize this to the Black Lives Matter protests that we saw through the teens, and then, really culminating in the protest against the murder of George Floyd. The methodology of Black Lives Matter was disruption first, right? That is, shut it down. Let's cut through our collective complacency by shutting it down. And then number two, after it's been shut down, let's have some uncomfortable conversations. Let's get to those uncomfortable conversations and really tease out what it is that we need to be addressing moving forward. And let me just say this. This is this isn't a tangent, although one of my wags used to always say, if you're not off on a tangent, you're probably going in a circle. But this is not a tangent, but kind of really related to what we're talking about. And that is discomfort. When we're getting down to these uncomfortable conversations or discomfort, how do we address discomfort? Now, one of the bad things that came out of the DEI movement, a lot of good things came out of the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, right? I was part of it back in 2014, 15, 16, when it spilled over from the streets, the protests against what was going on by Black Lives Matter, what was going on with police and unarmed Black victims, spilled over into the campus and became part of the DEI movement. And I wrote about it at the time so people wouldn't get it confused and could see the real links between what was happening in the street, what was happening on the campuses, and then it spilled over from the campuses to the businesses. And the businesses started talking about DEI, right? So during that time, there was a lot of good stuff that came out, but one of the bad things that I saw coming out during that time, and I used to point it out, some people in my progressive circles disagreed with me. I used to catch a lot of flack for this, but we started talking a lot about safe spaces and keeping people from feeling too discomforted by certain kinds of speakers coming on campus, for example. And how some of those speakers, like at my own campus, Ben Shapiro in 2018 came, who's an avowedly virulent racist in a lot of ways and misogynist and everything, and a number of other ists, right, along the way. And people would say, you can't have him come on campus. And you can't have certain things even said in the classroom because that makes us feel unsafe. This was the key, unsafe. It didn't just make us feel uncomfortable, it made us feel unsafe. And therefore it needs to be shut down. And I used to say back then, do not go down that road. Down that road, destruction lies. It may seem like you're going to keep Ben Shapiro out or some KKK sympathizer out today, but tomorrow they're going to turn it on you because they always do. When you give people in authority that kind of power, they turn it on you. And that's what you see happening now. What you see happening now is a lot of administrators are saying, at least some of our Jewish students feel attacked, feel unsafe on campus when people criticize Israeli policy. Any criticism of Israeli policy is seen as attacking Jews, right? And by some Jewish students, even though many of the people in the encampments are themselves Jewish, right? At USC, the Jewish Voice for Peace had a big presence there. A lot of Jewish students in the encampment. A lot of Jewish students are and Jewish people in general in America are critical of Zionists and critical of the colonialist policies and apartheid policies in Israel. But some there's a not insignificant number of Jewish students and people who really identify with Israel and see any criticism of Israeli policy as an expression of anti-Semitism. And so conflate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. And what we have to make clear in this whole discussion is anti-Semitism is wrong. Anti-Semitism is bad. Anti-Semitism is evil. Being anti-mass graves is not anti-Semitism. Being anti-forced famine and starvation is not anti-Semitism. Being anti-incineration of babies is not anti-Semitism. Being anti the killing of 15,000 children is not anti-Semitism, right? And we have to make clear that distinction and get away from thinking that anybody on campus is entitled not to feel discomfort when they walk through campus. We should all be, the campus is the place for uncomfortable conversation. That's what Black Lives Matter was preaching all along. We need to have uncomfortable conversation. There needs to be a pedagogy of discomfort that we recognize and endorse and vindicate on campuses. And we make our classrooms and our campuses not safe spaces, but brave spaces for robust debates about controversial subjects. Right? Now, yes, I like the idea of some safe spaces in certain parts of the campus where I can go and be with, kind of a homeland when I'm having to deal with all this misogyny or anti-Blackness out here. Someplace I can go and decompress, a student center or whatever. But the classroom isn't that place, and the general campus isn't that place.
Thank you. And just to wrap up questions, and then we'll go to questions from the commission. What does it say, in your view, about the level of democracy when it's applied to a government, but in this case, it's university, the consent-based level of consent-based decision-making at play in an institution who chooses to not only initially respond by force, but to only respond by force to such a situation rather than open dialogue?
Oh, yes, a complete breakdown of any kind of consent-based deliberative process. Again, this is what we started out talking about. What is civil disobedience? Civil disobedience is part of a deliberative process. It's part of a dialogue. It's part of the conversation. It is a move in the conversation. It is saying the normal democratic process is not producing a just result. And so we need to introduce into the conversation something that's going to shake people up and have them pay attention to things that they haven't been paying attention to. So it's part of the conversation. And when you bring in violence workers who come in with riot gear, there's no conversation then. They are shutting off the conversation at that point. They are cutting off the conversation. So it's really anti-democratic and anti-deliberative processes and anti-consent-based decision-making to bring in the police at that point.
Okay, thank you. And do we have any questions by commission members? And unfortunately, 2 of them had to leave at 6 o'clock. But any questions, Jason, from you?
Yeah, the one note I made was I really like that idea of the pedagogy of discomfort, right? In many ways, I strive for that, and particularly the people that are most primed to be comfortable. One of my first rate my professor complaints was from somebody who said that we had an awkward 15 minutes and I made them talk about privilege. And I thought, this must be a white boy who took to a privileged space to complain about having to talk about privilege. And so like I really like that idea, and that and how productive that is, because there's, even if you're just frustrated, there's a reason you're frustrated, and talking that out, I think, is what liberal education is for. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, and one of the ironies is, I'm going back to, we're all old enough now, I think, in this conversation to remember what happened 3, 4, 5 years ago, right? That it used to be the people on the right side of the political spectrum who were arguing for more free speech and criticizing the snowflakes on campus who couldn't handle a little discomfort, and people on the left who were, kind of talking about, safe spaces and words that wound, and being uncomfortable, making them feel unsafe. And now you see how that has flipped around, where you have now a lot of people who are criticizing the encampment people and criticizing those who are criticizing our involvement in, Gaza in various ways. A lot of them are now coming out and they're saying the justification for shutting down those criticisms is it's making people who support Israel uncomfortable and feel unsafe. These are people on the right side of the political spectrum saying this now. And notice a lot of the people out there who are counter protesters, I saw this at UCLA for sure. I suspect you have the same thing happening in Indiana and Bloomington. A lot of the people who are joining the pro-Israeli counter protesters are Proud Boys and white supremacists and, very right wing kind of, I have a lot of conservative friends. I don't consider them, you can be a principled conservative and not be a bigot and not be prejudiced, right? We're talking about Proud Boy kind of folks who are out there with a lot of these pro-Israeli counter protesters. So it's flipped around, and now more people on the left, I think, than ever, more progressive people are recognizing the vital importance of free speech, and have come back around to embracing the value of free speech after kind of pushing away against it a little bit, 5 years ago when we were talking more about safe spaces and not letting certain speakers come to campus.
And that also reminds me of, like you mentioned, that people are saying they feel unsafe. And that was actually the very first thing our commission had to figure out was how were we going to decide how to help marginalized people in public safety. And one of the first things we decided was we weren't going to go around asking people how safe they feel. That we were actually going to try to use an evidence-based approach to safety, which it sounds like what you're recommending in your framework, where you use more objective standards of safety rather than simply asking and taking polls on how safe people feel, because I'm guessing that people with more socioeconomic privilege and general privilege in our society tend to have lower risk tolerances and lower levels of discomfort, and therefore would feel unsafe more often, or when they are inaccurately, when they are in fact physically safe.
Yes, and especially that we not confuse feeling unsafe with feeling discomfort. That's what I'm really getting at, right? That there's also the safety issue of, is crime going up or down in a community, or homicides going up and down? And we find in study after study that a lot of times when objectively the homicide rate is going down and crime is going down, people are still saying they feel unsafe, right? And so that their feelings are at odds with the crime statistics. But this issue I'm talking about has to do more with what's going on campuses when we're saying that somebody is feeling unsafe because they feel uncomfortable with something that someone else is saying, with a position that someone else is taking, with any kind of anti-Israeli policy criticisms. They say that makes me feel not only just uncomfortable, but unsafe. And therefore I get to shut it down. And if you say something that makes me feel uncomfortable, that's violence. You've just committed an assault on me. That's what you're hearing a lot. And we have to reject that. If we have to look at campuses as places for robust controversies and open debates.
Did you want to add anything, Bryce, to that?
Oh, I don't know. I fully disagree. I fully agree. Sorry. Yeah. Well, yeah, I agree with that. I mean, no, it's got to get tension in here now. Yeah. And we talk about this amongst organizers about how people don't really believe that impact is the most important thing over intent. Because if they did believe that, then we would be apologizing to every pro-Israel person who genuinely believes, or falsely, but genuinely believes that we are trying to attack them or eradicate them or something.
Right.
Like we have to, bring some rationality into this about what actually makes people unsafe, what is actually dangerous, and what should be the response to that. I think your framework is a great step on the path towards getting that society-wide consciousness, so that we can make rational decisions about keeping each other safe.
Great. And Cami, any questions for our guests in our remaining 6 minutes?
I just want to say that it has helped a lot because, I mean, I've had people say things that make me feel frustrated and everything like that, but it doesn't make me unsafe. It just makes me feel frustrated. And so other people need to know that, yeah, you're frustrated by that, but it doesn't make you unsafe. It just made you upset. So that's not the same as somebody starving you to death and like literally killing your family and bombing your house. That's just somebody saying something that upset you. So there's a difference. And we need to work on ending that. So I just really appreciate the framework that you're putting behind it, because there's a huge difference.
Yeah, I second what Cami just said, and I hope that, our commission will definitely try to use such a framework going forward, pushing it for the city and as much as we can for the university, but frankly, the IUPD doesn't have to talk to us. I'm not sure they will, but, yeah, we definitely would push that direction. In our last 5 minutes, do we have any questions from the members of the public in attendance? We have one here in person. Yeah.
As the only one.
Yeah.
I guess I'd love to run something by the way, I appreciate your comments as well. I think all of you alluded to this. And I can spell my name afterwards in the interest of time. Do you need my name spelling?
I have it, but if you can say your name.
Yeah, it's Hamayatollah Sharani. Hamayatullah. And last name is Shahrani. So I think there's a really double standard, when people are talking about feelings, oh, I feel unsafe. Well, that's very different than being bombed. You're losing the arms and legs and your family members and your little babies and being starved. That's real. I'm sorry, but feelings, it just seems very dishonest when people are like prioritizing how I feel above in trying to continue that for other people. It just shows such an extreme double standard. But so I totally agree with the comments and many of you alluded to that. So thank you for that. But my question is really for the professor and Bryce as well. I know you guys mentioned some inconsistencies or even differences with how even the university's reaction with the police and the SWAT teams and everything. And then also you alluded to, how different people could kind of see those different levels of civil dignity, the doubles between, what is a 1 versus a 4, that different people could kind of view different things as, what they should be categorized exactly, and when to use force. And I guess that what I'm seeing though, I suppose things began to make sense. And I want to run this by you guys, is if you kind of see what the real lens in which people in positions of power are seeing things. Because it seems like these procedures, rules, protocols, and they're the ones setting it, are the ones in power, in positions of privilege. And they're trying to protect, if you see it as them trying to protect their power, their privilege, and they're using it to silence people. Because what is more nonviolent than civil disobedience sitting in, right? And it seems like what they were doing by targeting you or others is to silence or actually make an example of the leaders and take away the leadership and scare others to say, okay, if you don't stop, this is what's going to happen to you in your future. Intimidation, exactly.
Top sweeping.
Exactly.
Getting the leadership out.
Exactly.
They can't go back to the can.
To do that, exactly. And then also, even with the 4 levels, it's not just different people seeing it differently. What we're seeing is the same people will actually categorize things differently depending on who it is and whether or not their interests are aligned with them. You see what I mean? Like the police and UCLA, for example, right? I mean, the violent ones were the pro-Israeli groups, the pro-Zionists. They were the ones causing the violence, but they were just letting them do it. They're there to stop the violence, but then when the nonviolent protesters who were predominantly, anti or pro ceasefire, they were the ones being targeted. That's why they were brought in. So if you kind of see it as the rules are just kind of being applied by positions of power selectively and inconsistently for the interests of those in power, for example, to hide the fact that they're making a lot of money in these investments in the military industrial complex and to control their positions, everything begins to make sense. And there's no irrationality. And I didn't know if you guys would agree with that, whether that's at play here, because I know that wasn't mentioned much, but from my perspective, when you start seeing it from that lens, through their lens, all of a sudden the pieces tend to fall into place very neatly. So I don't know if you guys agree with that or not.
I do agree. I mean, that's why I was talking about how, structurally, there's a good reason for why they did what they did, because, they have interests that they want to protect. And but there's also like an irrationality to it, because again, the other part of why I said you behaved in the way that they did was because they were just ignorant, right? They were fed misinformation. In fact, I've heard people say that they're deeply concerned that this movement is getting like millions of dollars of like foreign funding and stuff. And so like,
Misinformation.
yeah, like, and that, that has its roots in the same structural factors, but it's also, in terms of decision-making, a separate pressure, making people, do the things that they did against the protesters.
Yeah, and I'm sure they don't want to advertise or know that they have these investments in what's leading to the killing and massacring of civilians. So if that's kept silent, I'm sure they feel much more in control.
Yeah, to a certain extent.
So it kind of makes sense to me, but, and Professor, do you kind of see that as a reality, I should say?
Oh yeah, power matters, right? And so there's a power analysis that you're undertaking, and whether, sometimes rhetoric is made to line up with power in such a way as to rationalize and justify what power wants to do anyway. But there's also, as Bryce is pointing out, a kind of ideological, ideas dimension to this. Some people truly are ignorant. They need to have their consciousness raised. Sometimes when it is, that's one of the things that happens when students have their encampments, when there are these civil disobedience behaviors undertaken. They aren't going to change the real true believers in the status quo, right? A lot of people who really believed in Jim Crow segregation weren't moved by the Montgomery bus boycotts or by the crossing of the Pettus Bridge, right? A lot of people who really believe in the Vietnam War weren't changed in their opinions by the encampments. What you're trying to reach, though, are those other people who aren't so entrenched, right? To get their attention and have them start to think about something they haven't thought about before, cut through some of their complacency. And sometimes that helps to move the needle. We even saw it with the protest against the murder of George Floyd. We saw real changes in public opinion happen over time, and some of those changes stuck over time, right? Not the hardcore ones. We never reached a lot of the hardcore people, but we reached a lot of other folks, and that's what you even see happening at the universities. The universities a lot of times are going to be persuaded by what the donors want, what the donors say, et cetera, and they're going to make their policies march to the tune of the donors. But you also have other power factions on the university. At our university, for example, USC, our academic senate censured the president and the provost, and they almost got a no confidence vote. They came this close to no confidence vote. And other places, there have been no confidence vote. And you get a no confidence vote, that really undermines your power, in the institution. Even the censure weakens you. You're hobbled now. So and so you have a power conflict. The students that have their power, students have power. That's what we're seeing. And administrators worry about the power that students can flex. And other faculty members have some power. And so there are all those other power dynamics at play too.
Thank you. And the reason
We don't have time. Yeah, we don't have time for a follow-up. So, just very quickly, to summarize this, this session has been great for us to try to process, some of the power dynamics that we've seen here in our community around what is unquestionably political policing, that has been taking place here. And it's actually kind of scary, especially to your point, it's kind of scary to consider that whoever is in power made the calculated decisions that it's actually better for their PR to bring in a state SWAT team on their own students rather than risk having these power dynamics that your encampment and coalition is trying to expose, be exposed. And so, really reminding us that that is a calculated decision, although there is also rationality behind it, irrationality behind it, as you mentioned, of people just being, fed crazy theories and not understanding. And as well, you also mentioned at the very beginning that there's the educational power at play, that these institutions are forming the next generation of opinions. And so that's a real power that is also being protected in these efforts. So, thank you. So these are really important, topics. So thank you both, to Dr. Jody Armour and Bryce Green for helping the CAPS Commission to have this discussion and to learn more about these important topics. Yeah.
Thank you.
And let me just say this, because I told you, I love the time I spent in Bloomington, Indiana, and it's really great that a moment like this brings all of us together. Bloomington is connected to USC and UCLA. It's connected to Columbia and NYU. It's connected to UPenn and Emory and University of Texas. I mean, this is right where this brings us all together in a very kind of, I don't know, almost spiritual way. And so I'm glad to be part of this discussion as we're doing this in solidarity, y'all.
So we thank you so much
Thank
for your continued friendship and support of the commission, Dr. Armour. And thank you, Bryce. We hope that you'll continue to be a friend of the commission as well.
Certainly.
Thank you. All right, any motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
I second.
I second.
Your turn.
Okay, bye, everyone. Good night.